Okay. Matt, everything looks good from my end. If you see any video issues from your end, just let me know ASAP. All right, so I've done this presentation for a number of years. I've done it for my 9-week adult evening course. I even do this for some of my high school classes. I call this one, What Color Are the Skies of Mars? Anomalies from the Red Planet. Because as we're about to see, it's very, very challenging to truly be able to know for certain what is actually real from Mars. And stay tuned. Obviously, we're going to talk about extraterrestrials as you would expect, but there's going to be one final plot twist at the end that should leave you thinking. So let's get started. So, definitely the most Earth like world next to our own. It often surprises people Mars is not the closest planet to Earth. That honor actually belongs to the planet Venus. And Mars's distance from the Earth is widely variable depending on whether it's at what's called opposition from the sun, meaning we're the closest to us, or it's at conjunction to the sun, meaning it's on the other side of the sun from us. And so Mars can be very close or very, very far away. But ever since human beings have been exploring it, the red planet has given birth to legends of Martians and artificial structures. Many of these were the stuff of legend and inspires classic movies that we have from basically the 1940s into today, ranging from War of the Worlds, a classic, to Mars Attacks, even Marvin the Martian. So, where did this notion actually come from? Well, it looks like the first documented case, at least in modern astronomy, of Martians on Mars comes from an accidental translation back in 1877. This was very well respected Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli. And with his larger telescope, he meticulously made beautiful detailed surface maps of Mars as it rotated on its own axis. And by the way, did you know Mars is on almost the same identical tilt as Earth is? And it has almost a 24-hour period of rotation, a little over 24 hours. Again, very, very similar to the Earth. So when Mars was at what we call opposition, so opposite the sun closest to Earth, Schiaparelli started to draw maps like this. And he called these dark regions, these narrow areas that you see here, canali, which in Italian simply means channels, which could certainly be something natural to the terrain. The American media seeing this, a lot of them not knowing Italian, instead made a very, very lazy translation of canals, which implies artificial or man made. And so that really gave birth to this idea of a civilization on Mars. And people took this idea and ran with it. They asked, what if Mars was a dying planet? What if the only remaining civilization there was living around the warmer equatorial regions and was trying desperately to actually irrigate and draw water from the polar ice caps into these areas? Now, what's fascinating is on the left here, we have modern telescope images of Mars from NASA. On the right, we have Schiaparelli's beautiful drawings, and you can see they are very accurate. A lot of the darker regions actually do match up very, very well today, but officially no canals. So let's jump ahead about 100 years, Mars in modern times. What you are all looking at, and I'm sure that this group needs very, very little explanation, is very likely the single most controversial image ever taken during NASA's decades of exploration of our solar system, the legendary face on Mars. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the face, but I also think I can give you a good bit of backstory on it that you might not know. So these are from the famous Viking missions, Viking 1 and Viking 2. The Vikings were spectacular pieces of engineering. They were both orbiters and landers. So an orbiter, as the name implies, stays in orbit around a planet. It would then detach a lander that would drop to the surface, and that's how we actually got the first surface images from the red planet. And so while in orbit above Mars, this was photographed. And without a second thought, NASA immediately released this to the public. And there was a firestorm, the likes of which the space agency was not expecting at all. So right away, people likened this to the idea that there was a civilization on Mars. If you all look closely, you can see what clearly looks like a brow line, two eyes, the bridge of a nose there, nostrils, a chin. And if you look very closely, what some people even likened to an Egyptian headdress. So this really tied in with what Eric von Däniken was saying about ancient aliens. And people asked, what if human civilization actually began on Mars? There was some type of catastrophe, and then that civilization had to flee the planet. They eventually came to Earth, and that helped spur the Egyptian civilization that we know. NASA quickly adjusted and countered, and they said, no, it's not really a face. We orbited over it many different times, and only this one time did the sunlight ever hit at such an angle that made it look like a face. Further, do you all see the nostril right there? If you look over the rest of the image, you can see lots of little black points. NASA said these are areas where no actual information was returned, and so it just leaves a black dot. So it happened to just leave one right where you would expect to see a nostril. So NASA said, no issue, this is just a hillside. So, case closed? Well, maybe not. The space agency then drug its feet for the next 20 years in all subsequent missions, refusing to even fly back over this area, despite even urgings from some members of Congress. People who were actually at mission control working on the Viking team later came out and said, unbeknownst to the public, Viking 1 did reorbit above the face at many different times a day in many different light conditions, and it always looked like a face. But those images were never released to the public. So finally, due to increasing pressure, NASA orbited Mars Global Surveyor above the face in both 1998 and the early 2000s. And here you can see it hardly looks like the original face at all. NASA claimed again, this is just an eroded hillside that just that one time happened to look like a face. So, case closed? Well, maybe not. If you're interested in the face on Mars, I would say the seminal work is probably called Dark Mission, which is from Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra. And they go into the face in exquisite detail. And even these images that you see from Global Surveyor were actually heavily edited by NASA. NASA intentionally changed the ratio aspect. And so when they expanded and shrunk the image, it affected what's called the MIP mapping, which made additional pixelation. They also accused NASA of presenting to the public lower resolution images than what they actually had. Further, everybody, did you know that there was more here than just the face itself? Check this out, also from the Viking missions. This entire area of Mars is a raised region around the equator of Mars called Sidonia. And so here's a beautiful three-quarter shot. You can see the face on Mars in the background, but then also notice you can see what look to be five-sided pyramids. Once again, conjuring up for many people the idea that this was part of an earlier Egyptian civilization. NASA counters and says, no, these hillsides are just products of wind erosion. So the debate of the face on Mars continues to this day. Now, we do want to be a little bit careful, everybody. Even though we're MUFON and we're very, very enthusiastic about extraterrestrials, we also always want to be mindful of a phenomenon called pareidolia. So if any of you have ever explored Google Mars, you can get some very detailed looks at the Martian surface. This face came out. It was found by a regular person, just like any of us, in 2011 in Google Mars. And you can see it definitely appears to show a heavy-set balding man in a side profile view. Here's a large ear. There's the eyebrow, the nose, and the heavy chin right there. And even ancient alien theorists tend to think that this is just a natural formation that happens to look like a face. So we do have to be a little bit careful, and we always have to be critical of what. Okay, back to the action, everybody. Do we have any additional photographs from NASA missions that we might actually have life, even if not advanced extraterrestrial life? Could we actually have some more basic life on the red planet that's right in front of our face? So take a good look at this image that you see, a real NASA image, and think about what you're actually looking at here. Some people believe this is absolute evidence that near the polar regions, where there's definitely water ice underneath the Martian sand dunes, that we actually have trees and vegetation. NASA says otherwise. They say that what you're actually seeing here is darker sand beneath the sand dunes, which ends up eroding out and then cascading down the sides of the dunes. So take a good look at it. Some people believe that this is clear evidence of green trees and vegetation right here. So are they green trees or are they streaks of dark sand? Here's another shot. If I just showed you this picture, no context at all, and asked you, where is this? Probably a lot of us would probably guess the northwestern United States or perhaps Canada. It definitely looks like a dense pine forest, but this is actually right on Mars. Here are some up-close images of what we see right there, courtesy of NASA and JPL. One of the frustrating things, everybody, is even when NASA does appear to find something, how they handle it is often so unscientific. It causes not only a lot of frustration among amateur researchers like us, but a lot of suspicion as well. So check this one out. Back in 2004, the Amazing Opportunity rover spotted this object on a rock outcrop in the Meridiani Planum region of Mars. And so a lot of people thought this was the first genuine evidence of fossilized life on Mars. Now, you would think that if you were at NASA Mission Control at the time, how would you handle this? Probably over the course of many days, you would want to send commands to the rover, gradually have it move, reposition itself around the rock, take pictures in different light angles, maybe do a little bit of sampling. This is not at all what NASA does. The space agency instead decided for this one rock out of millions of rocks on the surface of the red planet to test out their rock abrasion tool, or RAT, and they promptly ground it to dust. And so here's a before shot, and based on the appearance, a lot of people ask, is this very similar to a type of fossil we have here on Earth called a crinoid? This was a marine fossil present in the Paleozoic era. So here where I live in Pennsylvania, you find these all the time. A lot of people think, could this have been a crinoid fossil? And so this was the after. This was the one rock that NASA decided to test this abrasion tool on. And so the fossil can no longer be found. And so it's frustrating because there are many, many brilliant men and women at NASA. And you want to be careful to not be so quick to criticize. But at the same time, sometimes the space agency seems to act in such unscientific ways that it almost sort of fosters this idea of a cover-up. Now, here's a big twist that you probably wouldn't even really think about. What color are the skies of Mars? And the answer might surprise you if we even have an answer at all. So take a minute from the comfort of your homes, take a look at both pictures that are original Viking images. One is the true original, one the color has been changed. So take a quick look, ask yourself, which one is the true original? Is it the one that you see on the left that's mostly red, or the one you see on the right that's mostly blue? Most people would probably guess the one on the left, but drum roll, the original is actually the one on the right. And so a little known piece of space history, when the Viking landers, Viking 1 and 2, first landed, The original images that they sent back looked very Earth-like. They looked like deserts in the southwestern United States with blue skies just like Earth. So then what happened? Well, I do have one spooky story from a person who was actually at the mission control team of the Viking landers. And they claimed that they were getting all these beautiful shots back with blue skies. Then they said one man walked in with great authority. He was wearing a dark suit, and nobody had ever seen this man before. And they said calmly and methodically, he went to every single monitor and reached underneath for the color adjustment knobs. Probably me and some of our older members probably remember how TVs had those knobs right underneath. And they said one by one, he changed the color contrast to more red on the monitors, walked out of the room, and never said a word, and nobody thought to actually change it back. And so this legend birthed the idea of what color are the skies of Mars? And I'll let you know this even actually continues today. Check these shots out. NASA's newer rovers actually have the ability to essentially do a selfie. So this is NASA's Spirit rover. It can take a picture of part of its own body, and that's very helpful to NASA. So number one, it can show if too much dust is blowing onto the solar panels. It can tell if anything else is damaged. And you can also see how the instruments on top of the lander are actually functioning. So here on Spirit, we have two things of interest. Number one, what looks like a black joystick cue, everybody, is called a gnomon. Just think like the word gnome, G-N-O-M-E. This is a gnomon, and it's essentially a primitive sundial. So NASA can photograph where the shadow is coming off of the gnomon, and they can tell the ballpark Martian time of solar day. What's more fascinating, though, everybody, are these little color swatches that you see. So we have blue, yellow, green, and red. These are intentionally sent to Mars with known colors so that when NASA takes these pictures, it can make the proper adjustments. And a lot of people don't realize that, but the majority of these probes are not sending back beautiful full color images. Either they're photographing through what's called a color wheel, and they're sending back blue and red and green images, and then NASA has to combine them. Or they're sending some type of black and white images, but with data, and so NASA makes the color adjustment. So the idea here, everybody, is these colors are known on Earth. So when the rover does a selfie of itself, NASA can see how the Martian lighting, the atmosphere has changed the colors, and then they can make adjustments. But they got caught, and in some of these pictures, you can see the color tabs, which are supposed to be a control group, have gone totally bizarre. What was deep blue became bright pink. What was green now looks yellow. In fact, I did a bit of research on this, and two different universities did studies on the recent NASA photographs returned from Mars. And they were very careful. They were very professional. They weren't accusatory. But both universities concluded, for some unspoken reason, NASA was artificially dropping down the blue values and artificially jacking up the red values from all these photographs returned from Mars, which is quite intriguing. So right there, you can see this is some of the data. Notice the blue value was high, it's artificially pulled down. The red value was low, it's artificially propped way up, which is interesting. Another thing that we have on Mars that is very similar to Earth is called Rayleigh scattering. So to the right, MGS, that stands for Mars Global Surveyor. And so this is a real picture of Mars that not only shows some nice clouds, but it also really shows a bluish haze to our atmosphere. Now compare that with the photograph of the Earth on the left, taken by the crew from the International Space Station. And in some ways, they do look very, very similar. But understand the official position of NASA and astronomers everywhere is that Mars's atmosphere is paper thin, only 1/150th as thick as Earth, and primarily carbon dioxide. So the prevailing mainstream belief is If you would stand on the surface of Mars without a spacesuit, not only would you suffocate, but due to the low pressure, the blood inside your body would start to boil in under a minute. Now, keep that in mind because towards the end of our presentation, we're actually going to hear from some whistleblowers who claim to not only have been to the red planet, but have not needed spacesuits at all. And now, to muddy the waters even further, NASA appears to be reverting to the original coloration. So check this out. On the right, we have the original, or thought to be the original, super red saturated photograph from the Vikings. Notice if you all look in the background, the Mons, the mountain in the background, is identical. So this is the same photograph. But then when the picture reappeared at a JPL press conference in 2014, now it looked a lot more like the original images, and the terrain looked more brown instead of red. So what's the truth of it? Now, as you're watching, you might think to yourself, well, I don't understand, Jim. That is interesting, but why would that be a conspiracy at all? Why would the colors matter? Imagine everybody, if just for a moment, what if back in 1976, when the United States first landed the Vikings on Mars, and keep in mind, the Soviet Union had never done it. So far to this day, no other country has actually landed a probe there except the United States. And that was 50 years ago. What if when the Vikings landed, their original equipment to try to detect wisps of life started to just go absolutely wild? What if, to NASA's shock, the atmosphere was far thicker than they believed, oxygen levels were far higher, and the probe started to send back signs of microbial life? Would NASA tell the world? And you might think, well, of course they'd tell the world. That'd be an amazing discovery. But think about this. If they told the world that Mars was habitable, right away, we would essentially have a repeat of the Oregon Trail during the pioneer days here in the United States. You would suddenly have every spacefaring nation, whether it was the Soviet Union at the time, or maybe France or later England or China gets involved, all racing each other to try to get to the red surface and colonize it. Instead, if you float this idea of a hostile world, paper-thin atmosphere, totally unlivable, that could easily give the United States a couple-decade head start. One last curious piece of information before we go on. If you all look here to the left, you can see this sampling scoop here of the Viking. And what's fascinating about it, this so far is the only Mars lander that has tested for microbial life. And did you know it came back positive? Here's the story behind it. The Vikings actually had onboard laboratories. They could scoop up soil and then actually add water to it inside their miniature laboratory. And both times they did, the landers got a reaction of nitrogen, which was essentially a waste product of microbial life being activated. NASA immediately ceased the experiment and said that something was polluting it. It wasn't actually accurate. But to this day, the scientists who created that experiment said, no, that was a perfectly valid scientific experiment. It worked. It showed there is microbial life on Mars. We have no way of knowing for sure because the space agency has never repeated it to this day. Another fascinating thing that we got from these amazing Vikings that we've never gotten since are these images. Did you know that we actually have photographs of snow and frost and ice on the surface of Mars? These are real pictures from NASA. They're absolutely beautiful. Here's one. And here's another one. And yet, after the Viking missions, all of these pictures promptly ceased. We never once got another good picture from the surface that showed that Mars actually has weather. Now, the only possible exception, but it was quite by accident, happened in 2008 with with NASA's Mars Phoenix lander. Now, me personally, I was very, very ambitious about this one. This was going to be the first space probe to ever set down by Mars's northern polar ice cap. Originally, the belief was that this polar cap was mostly dry ice, which is frozen carbon dioxide. But today we've had a real paradigm shift, and most scientists think it's likely this one is actually water ice that not only would be an asset for future Mars colonists, but microbial life might be using right now. And so I had two immediate frustrations. Number one, as you can see in the picture, this was simply a lander. It was not a rover. But number two, even more infuriating to me, the only camera we ever got to see as the public just frustratingly pointed down at the ground at the landing struts of the lander. We never got to see that beautiful panorama across the Mars polar ice cap. But that doesn't mean we didn't find something interesting quite by accident. Everybody turn your attention to the back leg of Phoenix right there. You have what certainly look like water droplets on the lander. Now, initially, if you're skeptical about this, you might think, well, you know what? That might just be some dust. The sunlight was hitting it at a certain angle. Over many, many days, when NASA posted these photographs, notice the droplets, whatever they are, appear to be growing larger. And this, everybody, is a really, really big deal because understand, if Mars's atmosphere is truly as thin as NASA says that it is, it would be impossible to have liquid water on the surface of Mars. As soon as you poured it, due to the low pressure, it would just boil right off into the thin atmosphere. Because we see liquid water drops, there's a very, very good chance Mars's atmosphere is thicker than we're being told. So far, the only mainstream explanation about this, scientists have said, well, maybe the high salt content of the soil dropped the boiling point so much that the water didn't immediately sublimate. Like, you know how, for example, if you're boiling water on the stove and you want it to boil a little bit faster, you add salt. They're claiming that's what's happened here. Me personally, I'm much more skeptical. I think those are liquid water drops. I think they are growing, and we're not being told the entire truth. One of the frustrating things, everybody, in this decades-long shell game with space agencies is, did you know that images used to be released live to the public right away? We're taxpayers, our taxpayer dollars are supporting these missions. And so they used to be put out right away. That's the only reason we have the face on Mars. Well, that, everybody, all changed in 1996 for Mars Global Surveyor for a very, very questionable reason. So the camera on MGS was made by Malin Space Science Systems, including this scientist here. Not a big fan of this man personally, Michael Malin. And NASA's explanation was all of the photographs, because they're taken by Michael Malin's camera, are the exclusive property of Michael Malin. And so they claimed that this one man who simply designed the camera that was used on the mission had to actually approve every single photograph before it was sent out to the public. It's a completely nonsensical explanation, but that was basically their opening to oftentimes delay photographs getting to the public for weeks after they're actually taken. Now, that doesn't mean some interesting things haven't slipped through in the meantime. So I'm going to show you some of the more curious pictures from the surface of Mars. This, everybody, became dubbed the Martian Bigfoot. So this was photographed in 2004 by Spirit rover. Spirit is looking over the side of a crater. And immediately out beyond the crater, you see what sure does look like a Bigfoot. But obviously, this begs a number of follow-up questions. As we all know, even though a lot of us might be much more pro-Bigfoot, the reality of Bigfoot on Earth is still debated, let alone Bigfoot being present on Mars. So could it just be pareidolia or an interesting rock outcropping? It certainly could, but if you look closely, it is interesting how on a surface as weather-beaten as Mars, with officially such a thin atmosphere, such delicate rock protrusions could survive to this day. Now, maybe not looking quite as impressive as the Martian Bigfoot, but even tougher to explain, Curiosity photographed this, which became known as the knob. So if you look at the rest of the terrain, it looks like standard Mars rock. And then right there, sticking right up, almost like a trailer hitch on a trailer, you have what looks like a curious artificial knob. Now, NASA did respond, and they immediately came out and said, well, it's only 2 centimeters high. Because what happens a lot when there are anomalous things in photographs, the space agency often says, well, it looks weird, but it's just really, really small. As if, okay, it's just small, so it must not be anything. Now, if you look at the original photograph, in fairness, you don't see anything else in the photograph for scale. We aren't able to see any parts of Curiosity. But being familiar with the other photographs that it took, I think it's highly unlikely this structure is only 2 centimeters high. Now, I always try to read the other side of the story. What do skeptical scientists say? And a lot of scientists said, well, maybe this was just a metal intrusion in the rock that happened to get exposed here. But if that were the case, everybody, we should see other shiny areas throughout this photograph, and we don't see any. So right there, plain as day, sticking up, is what sure does look like a trailer hitch up out of a Martian rock. There's also been a number of times, and if you were with me for my earlier presentation on the moon, where the space agency has been caught airbrushing things. So this that you see here was a real image from NASA JPL. Notice most of the terrain is in very, very high resolution, except one object right in the foreground, looking somewhat artificial, is very, very poorly airbrushed. And again, we have a number of women that have bravely come forward over the years as whistleblowers, like Miss Donna Hare, a former NASA employee, and they claimed their duty at the space agency was to airbrush things out of photographs that astronauts were taking from Earth orbit, from the surface of the moon, from the surface of Mars, that the public simply was not ready to see. Okay, I have one last good one for you before we change subjects. If you all look way back there in the background, Curiosity photographed this in April 2013, and it appears to look like some type of bright geyser shooting up out of the surface. Here's a close-up right here, and I'm far from an imaging expert, but to me, if y'all look, the bottom looks flat, and then it flares upwards as if something is shooting up. Now, if you're the space agency, you would think that they would deem this a fairly high priority, and they would spend a couple days carefully driving Curiosity over there to investigate it. Even if it has nothing to do with advanced extraterrestrial life, maybe it's a water geyser. Maybe around it, they might find the first evidence of true microbial life on Mars. Instead, the space agency dismisses this and doesn't drive the rover over at all. They claim it's either a reflection off a rock or a cosmic ray hit on their camera at the exact moment it took the photograph. But what NASA was not banking on, everybody, is that amateurs like us actually went into their raw image database. Please examine the bottom photograph. A day later, the rover is around the hillside in the other direction and again photographs off into the distance, and they see the same exact bright shape. So it couldn't be a reflection off a rock because the photographs are from two very different vantage points. And what are truly the chances of a cosmic ray striking the camera at the same exact time on 2 different days? This one has never truly been explained. Okay, our next video clip is coming up. There have actually been so many missing probes at Mars. Probes that didn't work properly, that malfunctioned, probes that crashed, or some probes simply vanished without a trace, that some have actually joked that there is a galactic ghoul on the red planet, somewhat quarantining us humans from it. And so the Americans, the Soviets, the British have lost these. In fact, upwards of 60% of Mars probes have either failed or only been partially successful. Now, in fairness to the brilliant men and women engineers at NASA and other space agencies, outer space exploration is incredibly challenging. And understand, everybody, even when Mars is at its closest to us, it is still about 2 light minutes away from us. And so what that means is even if we send a signal out to an orbiter or a lander, it's going to take a good 2 minutes to actually get there. So divorce yourself of any idea of engineers sitting at JPL with a joystick playing a very, very high stakes game. All of this has to be done automated, and it is very, very challenging. But still, a number have disappeared. And what I want to highlight tonight with you is the strangest disappearance. This, everybody, is the curious case of one of Mars's 2 asteroid moons called Phobos. So Earth and Mars are the only inner planets, the only terrestrial planets that have moons. We have one moon. It's quite large. It's called Luna, or just the moon. It's the 5th biggest moon in the solar system. In stark contrast, Mars's moons are very small. They're named Phobos and Deimos, which is Latin for fear and panic, which really hammers home the god of war mythology of Mars. These are officially asteroids that got too close to Mars, and then the red planet sucked them in with its gravitational pull. But Phobos is quite odd because gravitational readings appear to show it is mostly hollow inside. Now, unlike the United States, the Soviet Union has been fascinated with this little moon for nearly Pope. So the Soviets were very, very open about what actually happened. Here we have one of their cosmonauts. This was Marina Popovich. She actually went on a speaking tour, including stops here in the United States. And she actually showed one of the last pictures from the Soviet Phobos 2. So here it is approaching the irregularly shaped asteroid moon. And Popovich is pointing to this right here. The Soviet Union claimed out of nowhere the probe was actually slammed into with some type of impactor and was totally destroyed. NASA countered and said, no, the Soviet Union is wrong about their own probe. That's not a physical object. That's simply an image artifact and isn't actually there. But tougher to disprove is this. The Soviet Union also released this photograph that showed a 9-mile-long cylindrical disc-shaped shadow racing across the surface of Phobos right before the little probe was actually destroyed. And there is an urban legend follow-up to this. They claim that the Soviets didn't release the final image to the public. It was apparently so upsetting to them, they went directly to the Vatican about it for assistance. And so one last odd thing about Phobos, I wanted to show you this iconic Stanley Kubrick film, 2001: A Space Odyssey. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the monolith. What's interesting is that a lot of people know this image about the monolith, but they don't actually understand why Kubrick included it in the movie. And what the director was actually trying to represent, this is essentially what we would now call today a von Neumann probe. So there's an idea that advanced civilizations could actually robotically, remotely explore other solar systems by essentially just sending out swarms of probes. They would essentially land on some of these worlds without life and then go dormant. They might stay dormant for thousands or millions of years. But then when they recognize life signs, they actually activate and they beam a signal back from the civilization that sent them there. So keep in mind that image when you look at this one here. This is also on the surface of Phobos. This became known as the Phobos monolith. Now, initially, me actually being somewhat skeptical, I would look at it and say, yeah, that is curious. It does look like a rock that just happens to be very, very rectangular. But interest really peaked when none other than second man on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, actually gave an interview and directly said this quote. Aldrin said, "There's a monolith there, a very unusual structure on this little potato-shaped object that goes around Mars once every 7 hours. When people find out about that, they're going to say, who put it there? Who put it there? Well, the universe put it there, or if you choose, God put it there. So lots of mysteries remain about this little moon of Mars. Okay, we're on the back half now, and now it's time for some absolutely delicious space conspiracies. So, is there a chance, everybody, that part of the reason we're either given inconsistent, incomplete, or downright misleading information from governments and space agencies isn't because we haven't been to Mars, but it's because not only have we actually been there, but we have a very, very active and growing human colony on the red planet right now. Let me share some of these amazing stories. I'm sure you're all familiar with Art Bell and Coast to Coast AM, classic. Well, one night during the iconic broadcast, a woman calling herself only Jackie called in, and she claimed that she was actually part of the NASA mission team, and her job was to download telemetry from NASA's Viking lander. And she claimed that they actually had a live video feed of the lander right at NASA. And then, to her shock, and to the shock of most of the engineers in the room, two human beings walked up to the Viking on the surface of Mars. And she said they were wearing what she called protective suits. She said they didn't look like full spacesuits, like what US astronauts were wearing at the time, but they looked like protective suits. And they started to service the lander. She said at that point, all of the higher ups at NASA pushed the rest of them out of the room, yelled for them to get out. And Jackie said they rolled essentially butcher block paper over the glass doors and they were not allowed to see in. She believes she accidentally saw a glimpse into a secret space program. Now, it is a compelling story, and me personally, I hope that it's true. But a lot of skeptics have pointed out Viking 1 and 2 officially did not have video capabilities. They only had capabilities to take still photographs. So is Jackie's story entirely a hoax? Well, it doesn't end there. Back in 2016, the internet was abuzz again when a selfie returned by Curiosity certainly appears to not only show the shadow of a man leaning over it, but once again, he doesn't even have on a full spacesuit. So if you look, this is the rover taking a selfie of itself. You can see part of it there. You can see the shadow. And you have what certainly looks like a man leaning over with a jug or grabbing an apparatus, an instrument on the top of the rover. And it looks like he is wearing goggles. You can quite clearly see his hair and some type of life support backpack on him. Now, scientists have tried to debunk this, and they said, no, you're not actually seeing a man there. You're actually seeing a shadow of the rover's instrument arm from a lower sunlight angle. But me personally, everybody, I've done a side-by-side, and I still have great difficulty trying to equate this arm with the shadow that we see right here. And that's not the only shadow. This one later appeared, another image of the rover's shadow, and it again appears to be a person standing right beside it. Now, these allegations of astronauts on Mars date back farther than you think. In fact, I even have some found footage for you to examine of an alleged secret NASA mission to Mars called Project Red Sun. So some actually claim that Apollo was not ending at Apollo 17, that the mission actually expanded and continued the whole way to Mars. And none other than first and second man on the moon, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, along with astronaut Elliot C., actually made the first human trip to Mars. And these are photographs of them there. Now, let me take a very, very skeptical side to this, but then I'm going to show you the footage anyway, and you can decide for yourself. I think overall this idea is relatively unlikely for a couple reasons. Number one, the mission allegedly takes place while Armstrong and Aldrin are already very, very famous. In the wake of Apollo 11, they took a year-long goodwill tour around the world, and they remained so famous throughout their lives, it would have been very, very tough for both men to disappear for a time. The other issue we have, some of you might think, boy, I really know NASA history. I don't think I've heard of Elliot C. Well, that's because tragically, C never actually got to fly to the moon or even on a Gemini mission. He was killed in 1966 when his T-38 Talon actually crash landed as he was trying to land at a factory in St. Louis that was manufacturing part of the Gemini mission to check it out. He lost control and his Talon skidded across the runway, hit into a hangar, and exploded. So for this to be true, it would essentially require Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to be in two places at once and to essentially bring an astronaut back from the dead. My personal guess is these pictures that you see are probably real, but more than likely, they're probably Apollo astronauts training out in the desert of the southwestern United States. So you might ask then, why are we even going through this exercise if it's a hoax? Well, we have Project Red Sun footage, and I can tell you some of the footage is so good, I have difficulty explaining it away. Now, as I unshare and Matt shares this one, we don't get the benefit of any audio. It's totally silent, but the video is very good. Okay, so we begin with a NASA worm logo, which came out into the 70s. They didn't have it in 1970. This came out early 70s. So this is allegedly found footage from Project Red Sun from 1973, which is about 4 years after Neil and Buzz landed on the moon. Now you can see we get a nice microgravity shot. And here we have, they called it Columbus. And so it's floating. And then we cut to a shot of the Earth. Now, initially watching this, I think, okay, they probably got that shot from the Apollo missions. But here's where it starts to get interesting. Look at this shot. You've got the Earth and moon together. And understand the Apollo missions went to the moon, not away from it. So right away, that's a very difficult shot to fake right there. I'm not saying it's not fake, but whoever did that had a degree of skill. Now they're getting farther and farther away from both the Earth and moon. Now, Matthew, if you don't mind, just get ready on the pause button a time or two. Keep going for now, but just be ready. Okay, we then get day 100. And understand, this is well beyond the official length of the Apollo missions. Okay, Matthew, if you don't mind, give a quick pause here, quick pause. So one of the reasons this is challenging to believe at first, from all the books that I've read on the Apollo missions, everybody, to the moon and back, by the later Apollo missions, they were called the J missions. Even when they stayed on the moon for 3 days, the entire mission took about 11 to 12 days tops. And that's really, really, really pushing the life support capabilities of the command and service and lunar modules. So to assume that all of a sudden you can take a Saturn V and slightly modify it to send it towards the moon, I do think strains belief. Even though those microgravity shots are nice, you have to admit we miss the one really inexplicable money shot where they pan around and they show Neil and Buzz and Elliot C. We never get to see the astronauts at all. So you're probably thinking, okay, it's just a hoax. But watch how good some of this footage is as Project Red Sun arrives at Mars. Go ahead, Matthew. Okay. As you watch the image of the planet, you're going to notice it's way more than just a static image. You not only see weather moving across Mars, but you're also going to get shots where you see the edge of the window of the command module. And then the camera quite naturally goes in and out of focus between the glass of the window and Mars in the background. So if it's a hoax, it's a really, really good hoax. Now, as you continue to watch, you can quite clearly see clouds, you can see weather, you see very high detail, and in a moment, you're going to see recognized surface features. Right there, you see the biggest canyon on Mars, the Valley of the Mariner. Matthew, could you give one quick pause here? Perfect. Now, if this is fake, how did they do it? Turn your attention to what you see there on the right. That appendage is not a part of the Saturn V rocket, the Apollo Command Lunar Service Module, nothing. My guess is if they hoax this, that is actually part of the International Space Station. And what they've done is they've taken space station footage from the foreground, and in the background, they photoshopped in Mars. But boy, oh boy, is it good. Matthew, go ahead. Let's just enjoy just a little more from Project Red Sun. And so we get some nice shots from Martian orbit. And if you watch this footage long enough, you eventually see a landing sequence. Here's a beautiful shot of Mars's northern polar ice cap right there. Some people have watched this footage and they think there's a chance that somebody took space probe footage from NASA and then digitally photoshopped in parts of an actual spaceship. And so I watch this footage and I do approach it more skeptically, but at the same time, if it is fake, I would love to know how somebody did it because it is really, really high quality. So maybe some of you aren't that into this, but maybe some of you really like a good urban legend, some good found footage, almost like the Blair Witch Project from outer space. So if this intrigues you, I would encourage you to do your own digging. This one was Project Red Sun. Matthew, this was perfect. Thank you so much. You can go ahead and stop the video. And I'll just go ahead and reshare. Thank you. That was excellent. Okay, you've been an amazing group. I believe I have one last part to go with a little bit of a plot twist here at the end that I do think that you'll really, really enjoy, everybody. Okay, so even if Project Red Sun isn't real, we have a growing number of whistleblowers that have come forward and said, not only have we been to Mars, but we have been there for a very long period of time. Let me just give you a sampling here. Here you can see Andrew Basiago. You might recognize him. The media and scientists would certainly like to just portray him as a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, but he's actually quite a genius. He's a board-certified lawyer in the state of Washington. He holds 2 doctoral degrees. And about 8 years ago, he actually had a brief run for president of the United States. Now, like any of these minor party candidates, he dropped out very, very quickly. But I read his website and his campaign promises, especially as they related to extraterrestrials and the secret space program. And I can definitely say if Mr. Basiago did become president, we would already be living in a very different country in a very different world today. Also included here, everybody, is the granddaughter of beloved President Dwight Eisenhower. Here we have Laura Eisenhower. So understand, some of these whistleblowers aren't just completely random people that nobody's ever heard of before. These are fairly well-known, noteworthy people. And so Andrew Basiago went into great detail, and he claimed to be part of a very real secret space program called Project Pegasus. And his details were absolutely spectacular. Not only did he say he was part of this program, he actually said he was part of it with a very young Barack Obama, who at the time went by his given name, Barry Soetoro. So that's a lot to digest. Let me explain. As a young man, Basiago said he and Obama and a number of promising young individuals were recruited out in California by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Association, one of the more highly classified groups within the U.S. government. And sure enough, at the time, a young Obama was attending college at the College of the Siskios, which was not far away from where Basiago lived. And he claimed for this program, no rockets were actually needed at all. Reminiscent of a classic Star Trek episode, he said after the young men were trained, they were taken into a secret DARPA facility jump room, and they were essentially teleported directly to the surface of the red planet. He said not only did they not need any spacesuits, and Mars was actually quite Earth-like. But he said when they got there, the future president glibly remarked, well, we're here. And I always found that little detail of Basaggio's story to be fascinating. Like, think about this. If you're going to just totally hoax something, if you're going to make up a story, and you're going to include somebody very, very well known like President Barack Obama, wouldn't you have Obama do something awesome like fight extraterrestrials or try to save the mission, be a hero? Instead, he just glibly says, well, we're here. And what's interesting is Basaggio's revelations came out when Obama was president. Surprisingly, the White House did respond to this story. They didn't ignore it. And they said, no, sadly, President Obama has never actually been to Mars. But for all of those who claim that they have been, this includes Andrew Ruff, Randy Kramer, who you've probably heard of, Corey Good, who you've definitely heard of. They all tell nearly identical stories. They dubbed this program 20 and Back. So check out this amazing diagram. If you are into time travel, if you've ever read any physics books, mainstream books on time travel, this is what they always show. This right here, everybody, is called a world line. So imagine your existence not just as a three-dimensional existence, but as a four-dimensional existence. This is essentially a timeline of your life. So most of us, sadly not involved in secret space programs, would just have a very, very straight arrow. We're born, we're babies, we're little kids, we become adolescents, then adults, then older adults. This is our timeline. But all of these men claim when they were very young, they were abducted one night from their bedrooms, not by gray extraterrestrials, but by members of a secret space program. They were then jumped out to Mars, just like Basaggio claimed, and they would serve a full 20-year enlistment on Mars. They claim not only is the atmosphere habitable, but there are indigenous life forms that can be quite hostile to humans. And so their jobs were actually to protect the scientists, the colonists who were there. Then, when their 20-year time was up, they were not only jumped back to the time they left, but they were further age regressed. So their parents woke up the next morning, went into their son or daughter's bedroom, checked, everything seemed to be just fine. They then grew and aged normally here on Earth, only gradually starting to recall these memories. And so you might think, well, it would be easy to hoax something like that. But it is fascinating how many of these people who don't even know each other tell nearly identical stories. So do we finally have our smoking gun? Probably a lot of you are very familiar with Canada's former Minister of Defense, Paul Hellyer, who for decades has bravely served as a whistleblower that extraterrestrials are among us. But then in 2020, we had Chaim Eshed, Israel's former Minister of Space Defense. Now, as a much older man in his 80s, he said he didn't really care about the consequences anymore. He publicly shared that not only are extraterrestrials visiting Earth, not only is there essentially a United Nations of extraterrestrials, which he dubbed the Galactic Federation, but the United States and Israel are already working with extraterrestrials on the surface of Mars. When people turn whistleblower, one of two things happen. Either they're old enough that their security oaths have entirely expired and they're legally allowed to tell what they've seen. Or like Chaim Eshed, they get into their late 80s, they feel like they've led a good life, and they just want to share what they actually know to try to move humanity forward. So at the very beginning, I promised you one twist, and we're finally there. Are we on Mars at all? Or is there a chance we either have never been there, or all real Mars imagery became the property of the secret space program long ago? Now, I've been reporting on this one and sharing for years, but now it's becoming quite mainstream. So there's a good chance a lot of you know about this final one. What you see on your screen is the largest uninhabited island on Earth. This is Devon Island, Canada. And the only thing that's actually on Devon Island is a NASA practice rover facility. And as you all examine the terrain, you can probably see exactly why NASA chose this place. It's not only cold, it's unforgiving, it's hostile, it's remote. And if you look at the color of it, the color perfectly matches Mars right down to the ice caps that we have there. And so we have pictures, this is not a secret, of NASA rovers being tested there. But over the last 10 to 15 years, people are starting to ask, are we sure this is all that actually happens there? And so some people ask, are a lot of these images that we're being told are Mars, are they actually photographed on Devon Island? Here's one of the best examples. This photograph you see is officially from Mars, but it became dubbed the Mars squirrel. So if you all look to your left, you can see between those two rocks, we have what certainly looks like an adorable little squirrel. There you can see the front legs, the ears, the eyes. And skeptically, you could say, well, yeah, it does, but it's just a rock that happens to look like a squirrel. But what's fascinating is here on Earth, there is a species of lemming that looks absolutely identical to this. I have it right here. However, this species of lemming only lives one place on Earth, and that place, my friends, is on Devon Island. So think back very, very quickly to the coast-to-coast AM caller of Jackie. Imagine for a minute, what if Jackie was telling the truth, but what she thought was Viking showing images from the surface of Mars? What if it was actually just showing a feed from Devon Island? And so the two men that she thought were in some type of protective suits were actually just scientists wearing cold weather suits to protect them from the Canadian wilderness. And so that's one final clip that I wanted to leave you with right there. Now, not to hype my own work, but if you're interested, this is the one and only time I was ever actually published from the UK-based Phenomenon magazine. And they did a phenomenal job of it. And this was called, Is the Habitability of Mars Being Kept a Secret? And so this was issue 131. This was March of 2020. And so I give some good evidence over the years of inconsistencies, including mentioning scientist Donald Menzel. It's actually Donald Menzel whose flawed calculations on Earth here led to this strident belief that Mars's atmosphere must be paper thin. And MUFON folks, if the name Donald Menzel sounds familiar to you, he was one of the 12 men revealed to be part of the top secret Majestic 12 project. So after our presentation, I'm going to share this PDF with Matthew. And then if anybody's interested, I'm sure Matthew would be happy to share it with you. That way you don't have to try to track it down from the Phenomenon website. But I assure you, this magazine is absolutely fantastic. It's phenomenonmagazine.co.uk. So little shout out there to a great magazine, and they were nice enough to publish me back.